Picture this. You're 10 years old. Your hands are shaking. Your mother is crying in a language she's not allowed to speak anymore. And the priest gripping your arm tells you it's an honor. You don't feel honored. You feel stolen. You've just been chosen to serve the goddess Vesta, Rome's sacred flame. But tonight is not about gods. It's about obedience. You walk barefoot through the forum, past marble temples and stone-eyed statues. Citizens kneel as you pass. Senators nod with approval. And the emperor, yes, the emperor, watches from his balcony like he owns you. Because now he does. You've been dressed in white. But you don't feel pure. You feel erased. You're not a daughter anymore. Not a child. Not a person. You're a symbol now. A vessel. A virgin. They lead you into the house of the Vestals, past the walls that will hold you for the next 30 years. Your first night is silent. No family. No comfort. No fire, not yet. Because first you must lie alone in the temple. No mattress. No food. No prayers. Only shadows. And the knowledge that if you fail, if you let the fire go out, if you fall in love, if you are ever touched, they will bury you alive beneath the city that praised you. Your heart races. The gods may not be watching, but Rome is. And tonight they're watching to see if you will burn. You never asked for this. The decision was made before you were old enough to understand what it meant. The Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest, pointed to you among a group of girls. Maybe because your father had no sons. Maybe because the stars fell right on your birth. Maybe because you looked obedient. The reasons didn't matter. Once your name was spoken, your fate was sealed. They called it an elevation, a divine calling. But it felt more like an abduction. Your family didn't protest, not because they didn't love you but because they couldn't. To refuse the priesthood was to curse your bloodline. So you were taken, dressed in white, given a new name, a new house, and a new life. The old one was erased. You were now one of six. 6 Vestal virgins, keepers of the eternal flame, living embodiments of Rome's purity. Revered, protected, feared, and watched. But what the city didn't see was the cost. 30 years. 10 years to train. 10 to serve. 10 to teach the next terrified child. You were taught to tend the flame, memorize rituals, speak to gods who never spoke back. You weren't allowed to laugh too loud, walk alone, or even look too long at a man. Every move measured. Every thought policed. Your body was no longer yours. It belonged to the state. Your virginity wasn't a virtue, it was currency. As valuable as gold, as fragile as breath. And if you lost it, whether by force, by love, or by whispered accusation, it didn't matter. The law was clear. Virginity or death. And death came slow, sealed inside a stone chamber underground, where you'd starve in darkness while Rome whispered prayers above your grave. This wasn't sainthood. This was sacrifice. If this kind of history hurts your soul, but you want to see it remembered, pause, subscribe to the History Scar, and keep watching. And if you won't subscribe, at least explain why in the comments. We'll be here waiting. The first night is the longest. You sit alone inside stone walls that echo with prayers you don't yet understand. No mother to hold your hand. No father's voice to calm you. No soft blanket from home. Just a slab to lie on, a bowl of water, and the flickering shadows of torchlight dancing on marble floors. The temple breathes like something alive. Silent. Watching. Waiting. Statues of Vesta stand guard, cold, blind, unmoved. Her presence fills every crack in the stone, every breath you try to take without trembling. You've been told she is gentle. But tonight, her silence feels like judgment. They told you to sleep near the sacred hearth. Not too close. Not too far. Just close enough to feel its heat, to know its power. That flame has never gone out. And now, part of its survival rests with you. But you can't sleep. You lie awake for hours, eyes wide, heart drumming in your chest like a war march. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind through the columns sounds like divine warning. You want to cry. But you don't. Tears in the temple mean fear. And fear means weakness. And weakness, they say, offends the gods. If you break down, it won't be seen as childhood. It will be seen as danger, an omen that the new girl is not strong enough to carry Rome's purity. Because your duty isn't just your own. If the flame dies, if the rites are performed with trembling hands, the blame won't fall on you alone. They will say Rome is falling. That the empire is vulnerable. That the gods are turning away. And all of it will be because of you. What would you say to a child locked alone in a god's house? Because Rome said nothing. Rome just watched. They called it the eternal flame. But to you, it was a test you could never pass. The fire in the temple of Vesta wasn't just a symbol. It was a prophecy, a living oath, a mirror reflecting the fate of an empire. As long as it burned, Rome would stand. If it went out, even for a moment, it meant disaster. Plague, famine, invasion, civil war. So they told you, don't let it die. Not ever. There were no second chances. No forgiveness. The flames had to be fed constantly, oak logs, perfectly dried, placed with sacred precision. Not too fast. Not too slow. Even the way you tended the fire had to be ritually exact. And the worst part? You had to do it in your sleep. You were expected to rest beside it, eyes closed but mind alert. The fire didn't keep you warm. It kept you hostage. Every crackle made you jump. Every dip in its glow sparked panic. Some girls began sleepwalking. Others couldn't sleep at all. The whisper said insomnia was a blessing. It showed devotion. But behind closed doors, girls collapsed from exhaustion. Some began hallucinating. A few forgot their own names. You prayed for silence. Instead you got footsteps. The priests came at night. Cloaked in shadows, they would check the flame, measure its strength, inspect the logs. And if they thought your fire was dying, they wouldn't ask questions. They'd make you kneel. Negligence wasn't a mistake. It was a crime. There were beatings, public shame, cold meals, isolation. Some girls were stripped of their vestments and paraded before the others as warnings. You weren't worshipping a goddess. You were managing a crisis, with your life as collateral. And all the while Rome cheered. Senators toasted your divine devotion. Citizens pointed to the smoke rising from the temple and said, all is well. But you knew the truth. You were the fuel. Your body wasn't yours. It was Rome's. Not in poetry, not in metaphor, in law. As a Vestal virgin, your chastity was considered more sacred than the temple itself. You weren't just keeping a vow. You were anchoring the fate of the empire. One crack in that vow, one rumor, one jealous whisper, one misplaced glance, and the entire city could descend into chaos. Rome didn't need proof. It needed suspicion. And suspicion was everywhere. You lived in layers of white. Not for beauty, but to erase your shape. Eyes cast downward. No perfume. No jewelry. You weren't allowed to be seen as desirable, because that might make someone desire you. And desire was dangerous. If a man was caught near you, he might be exiled or worse. If you were caught with him, there would be no trial in the sense we understand it. No defense. No mercy. The punishment was already written in stone. Burial alive. Because a Vestal who broke her vow couldn't be whipped or executed publicly. She was still technically sacred. So they dug a pit just outside the city walls. Gave you a loaf of bread. A lamp. A small jug of water. Then sealed the lid. Not to kill you. To let the gods decide. That's what they told themselves. That's what Rome told its people. But the truth was simpler. Your virginity was a symbol too valuable to stain, even in death. And yet, you weren't admired for your purity. You were hidden because of it. Controlled because of it. Society obsessed over your body while demanding you disappear. It's a pattern that didn't end with Rome. Medieval brides in Europe paraded bloody sheets to prove their worth. Women in modern society still face honor killings, purity tests, shame for intimacy that men celebrate. The stage changes. The obsession stays. The world has always praised virginity, as long as it belongs to someone else. You didn't need to be guilty. All it took was a whisper, a rumor, a failed omen, a sudden change in the wind. The fire dimmed and someone decided it meant you. If the flame dies, they said, the virgin is impure. No one questioned whether a log had been damp, whether the wood had burned too fast, whether the wind had shifted through the open-air temple. They questioned you. And once they questioned, you were already lost. The trial came swiftly. No audience. No jury. Only priests. Men who claimed to speak for the gods, but answered only to each other. You would not speak in your defense. You would not even be told who accused you. You would stand alone in front of them, draped in white, asked questions that already had answers written in blood. In the records they called it adjudication. But it was never justice. It was ritual. A performance of fairness to satisfy the state. The punishment was known long before the verdict. They could not spill your blood. You were sacred. So they buried you. Alive. A tomb was prepared just outside the city walls. A deep pit with stairs carved into the earth. A small stone chamber with no light, no door, no air. A couch for comfort. A lamp for illusion. A loaf of bread. A jug of water. That was mercy, they said. When the day came, the people gathered. Not to save you, but to witness your obedience. They watched as you were led through the city in silence, your head bowed beneath the veil. You were not to cry. You were not to scream. Screaming would make Rome look weak. At the edge of the pit, the priests turned away. They would not watch you enter. But they would wait to hear the stone dragged shut behind you. Then they walked back to the temple. Back to the flame. Back to the empire you had died for. Rome did not call it execution. It called it cleansing. It called it necessary. But it was murder. Wrapped in ritual. Disguised as honor. Would you survive silence in your own grave? If this broke your heart, subscribe to the History Scar. And if you won't, I challenge you to comment why you think this story shouldn't be told. They called you sacred. They said you had more power than any woman in Rome. That your touch could free prisoners. That your word could stop an execution. That you walked above the laws that bound others. But you couldn't vote. You couldn't marry. You couldn't own property. You couldn't leave. Power, they said, but only as long as you remained silent. As long as you followed every rule without question. As long as your body remained untouched and your voice remained useful. If you stepped out of line, your sanctity evaporated. Because the truth was this, your divinity was conditional. It wasn't protection. It was a leash. And religion was the rope they used to tighten it. They trained you to believe disobedience wasn't just a crime, it was cosmic betrayal. If you spoke up, you weren't just rebelling against men. You were defying the gods. If you ran, you weren't escaping chains. You were condemning your soul. This wasn't worship. It was weaponized faith. You prayed to a goddess who never answered. You followed rituals you didn't write. You lived under laws made by men who never once considered what it felt like to be 10 years old and told you were holy property. They made you fear your own thoughts, your own instincts, your own desire to be free. And they wrapped it all in sacred language so no one could call it cruelty. But you don't need Latin to recognize the pattern. Every age has found a way to use belief as a cage. Women locked in convents. Girls silenced by scriptures. Children told that obedience is salvation and questioning is sin. So before you turn away, ask yourself, how different is it now? Whose gods are still being used to control whose daughters? And who still calls it sacred? They said you were free. But you never spent a moment unobserved. Your home, the house of the Vestals, stood just steps from the Roman Forum at the very heart of the empire. It was no sanctuary. It was a cage made of marble and silence. Every hallway was lined with eyes. The servants who dressed you reported your moods. The priests who oversaw the rituals noted your posture, your tone, your hesitation. Officials from the state recorded your attendance, your expression, your stillness. Even your body was not your own. Menstrual cycles were tracked like military schedules. A late period could spark questions. Too many headaches and whispers of mental unfitness spread. A strange glance from a soldier passing by? Suddenly you're under investigation. Because in Rome, rumor was enough to ruin you. You learned quickly how to move like stone. To smile without feeling. To answer without thinking. To lower your eyes even when no one was looking because someone always was. There was no room for anger. No room for fear. And no room for grief. The only acceptable emotion was devotion. Some girls adapted. They became mirrors, reflecting only what others wanted to see. They drifted through years with empty eyes and perfect hands. Rome called them ideal. Others broke. Quietly. Tragically. One Vestal threw herself into the Tiber. Another stopped speaking entirely. A third scratched prayers into the temple floor until her hands bled. All of them were punished for what the city called weakness. But it wasn't weakness. It was pressure. The pressure of being perfect in a world where perfection meant disappearing. And still Rome praised them. Called them blessed. Called them symbols of peace. But symbols can't scream. And no one listens to a statue. If this feels like more than history, if it feels like a warning, let the algorithm know this story matters. Subscribe, comment, and never forget the girls in white who had nowhere to run. On paper, you were one of the most privileged women in Rome. You had a seat of honor at the games, front row next to senators. When you walked through the streets, even consuls made way. You were exempt from the death penalty. You could pardon prisoners with a single touch. They called you powerful, untouchable, sacred. But what they didn't say, what they didn't want to say, is that every one of those privileges came with strings. Invisible, silent, deadly. Because your protection only existed if you followed the script. The moment you spoke out of turn, questioned a priest, hesitated in a ritual, or simply carried yourself with too much independence, the protections vanished. The seat at the arena was taken away. The guards who once cleared paths now escorted you into silence. And if you ever challenged the system itself, you weren't punished like a citizen. You were erased like a mistake. Rome didn't like loud Vestals. It liked silent symbols. So your privileges were never truly yours. They were tools. The games? They were meant to parade you. To show the crowd that Rome honored its sacred daughters, while hiding how it used them. Your immunity? That was Rome telling itself it was just, while it buried girls alive for invisible crimes. Your fame? That was Rome's favorite lie. A lie it told the world to distract from the truth. You were never free. And the worst part? Everyone believed it. Tourists pointed to you in the streets. Poets wrote verses about your grace. Senators toasted your virtue at feasts. But none of them saw the eyes behind the veil. None of them heard the silence you lived in. Because the moment you stepped outside the lines, even slightly, your pedestal became a prison. And the same voices that once praised you would chant at your burial. So tell me, is that privilege? Or is that a leash made of gold? At 30 years old, your service ends. You've kept the fire alive. You've survived the rituals, the silence, the fear. Rome gives you a final ceremony. Applause. A wreath. A declaration, you are free. But what does freedom mean to someone who's never had a choice? You step into the city for the first time as a woman unbound. No veil. No priests. No curfew. But the world doesn't open its arms. It flinches. Who would marry you now? You've never touched a man. Never touched anyone without protocol. You've never been allowed to feel desire or express grief, or even speak casually with strangers. You weren't taught how to live. You were trained how to serve. To the public, you're sacred. A living legend. To men, you're untouchable. Not in reverence, but in discomfort. You're too old for a first bride. Too strange to understand. Too watched, too whispered about, too other. You walk into rooms and people lower their voices, not out of respect but out of fear that your presence means trouble. Some former Vestals tried to marry. Many were rejected. Some never conceived. Others simply chose solitude not because they wanted it, but because it was all they'd ever known. They became ghosts in silk robes. Respected. Remembered. Avoided. They had been sacred to Rome. But they were worthless to men. And Rome never looked back. Once the flame no longer needed you, you became part of the ash, silent, faded, gone. You had given your youth, your body, your voice, and your mind to the gods. And when they were finished with you, there was nothing left for you to take back. Not every Vestal stayed silent. Some learned to play the system from within. They memorized more than rituals. They learned where secrets were kept. Who whispered in the dark. Which men in robes feared their own reflections. One smuggled letters out of the house of the Vestals, exposing affairs between priests and nobles. Another delayed her own execution by intentionally sabotaging another's trial, buying time to alert a sympathetic senator. One wrote poetry, verses filled with quiet rage, masked as hymns to the goddess. They were copied by hand, passed between women, then lost to time. But their message remains etched in the stones. You will not remember us for our silence. They knew the power they were denied. And they used what scraps they could to turn it back on the empire. It wasn't enough to stop the cruelty. But it was enough to leave scars. When Christianity rose, the temples fell. The sacred fire was extinguished. The cult of Vesta dissolved. The last Vestals disappeared into history. But the trauma did not. The silence they had lived in became the silence surrounding them. They were remembered as symbols, not people. Marble figures frozen in purity, with no mention of the fear, the grief, the resistance. Rome told its story. The gods were satisfied. The flame had done its work. But beneath the ashes there had been rebellion. Small, quiet, deliberate. Acts of defiance that will never be listed in history books, but which burned far hotter than any eternal fire. This is not a story of holiness. It's a story of power, taken, twisted, and repurposed as obedience. And of women who, even in chains, still found ways to fight. Rome called it devotion. But it was control, dressed in white robes and lit by sacred fire. The Vestal virgins were paraded as saints. But they were never meant to be holy. They were meant to be obedient. Icons, not individuals. Statues, not souls. And behind every ceremony, every law, every prayer whispered beneath temple arches, there was fear. Not just fear of punishment, but fear of failing to be perfect. Fear of stepping out of line. Fear of being seen as human. Because if they were ever seen as human, Rome would have to admit what it had done. It would have to admit that it sacrificed children to maintain its image of purity. That it buried women to preserve the illusion of divine order. That it praised silence while building power on screams no one was allowed to hear. The Vestals were not warnings to sinners. They were warnings to Rome itself. And still we ignore the scar they left behind. Because even now we build systems on the same foundation. Purity as currency. Shame as discipline. Silence as survival. We see it in the classrooms that blame girls for their bodies. In the courts that question survivors more than offenders. In the homes where tradition masks control. We see it. And like Rome, we pretend it's sacred. But the scar of the Vestals is still healing. And you're part of that healing. If you've watched this far, I owe you nothing but truth. And you owe these girls one thing: memory. Subscribe to the History Scar, so stories like this never fade into silence. Like this video so the algorithm knows these voices matter. Share it because no one else will. And if you can't hit that button, leave a comment. Tell me why their voices don't deserve your attention. We'll be waiting. So will they.